The summer sun had burned hot over Hartford, Connecticut, on July 6, 1944. It was one of those days where the sky seemed to sizzle and even the breeze offered no relief. But none of that mattered to the families streaming into Barber Street. The Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus had come to town, and it was the highlight of the season. Posters were everywhere. Bold reds and yellows, lions mid-roar, acrobats frozen midair, and elephants in glittering headdresses. For children it was the closest thing to magic. For adults, it was a rare moment to forget the war overseas. Eleanor Davis held her son Billy's hand tightly as they approached the big top. Her husband, Frank, had recently been deployed, and she was doing her best to keep life normal for their 5-year-old. Billy wore a little cap and gripped a bag of popcorn nearly as tightly as he gripped her hand. The circus tent loomed before them, striped in red and white, massive and humming with life. The air buzzed with music and laughter. Inside, the bleachers were packed. Nearly 7,000 people crowded beneath the big top canvas. The tent was waterproofed with a mixture of paraffin wax and gasoline, standard at the time but deadly in hindsight. The smell of sawdust mixed with popcorn and animal musk, and the roar of excited chatter created a constant hum. The crowd hardly noticed the exits, let alone thought to plan how they'd leave if anything went wrong. No one imagined anything could. Near the back rows sat Thomas and Mary Franklin, an elderly couple who had brought their 3 grandchildren, Rose, Charlie, and Henry, to see the show. Mary fanned herself with her hat, already uncomfortable with the heat. "I told you it'd be hot in here," she muttered, dabbing her forehead with a handkerchief. Thomas grunted but smiled. "Just think about the kids. Look at them, haven't seen Charlie grin like that in months." Below in the performers' area, the circus acts began. Lions jumped through rings of fire. Trapeze artists soared. Clowns rolled by in tiny cars, eliciting squeals of laughter from the children. Eleanor watched Billy's eyes widen as a towering elephant named Anna lumbered into the ring, her trainer guiding her gently by the trunk. Near the canvas wall of the tent, a young usher named Jimmy Holt stood watching. He was 17 and new to the job, eager to prove himself. His uniform was slightly oversized, and he kept nervously tugging at his collar. He noticed a flicker above him on the canvas wall, a strange orange glow, faint but real. He blinked, thinking it was just a reflection from the ring below. But the glow didn't move, it grew. Then someone shouted. It started as a single voice, sharp and terrified. Then another joined, and another. Jimmy turned just in time to see the fire bloom like a living thing, snaking up the canvas wall in seconds. The wax and gasoline mixture made it burn hot and fast. Unforgiving. In less than a minute, the top of the tent was ablaze. Inside, panic didn't spread immediately. At first, many thought it was part of the show. One clown even pointed to the growing flame as if it were a planned effect. But then the smoke turned thick and black. The heat grew unbearable. A woman screamed, and that broke the spell. Then chaos erupted. Eleanor scooped Billy into her arms and bolted for the exit. People surged around her, pushing, screaming. The bleachers shook with the force of so many feet scrambling at once. "Keep moving," someone shouted. But there was nowhere to go. The tent had only a few exits, and most were quickly clogged with people. Jimmy tried to direct families toward an open flap, but the fire was racing faster than anyone could think. He saw a young girl trip near the edge of the bleachers and vanish beneath panicked feet. He dove in, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her up. "This way," he shouted, not even sure where he was pointing anymore. Mary Franklin had Henry in her arms. Thomas had grabbed Rose and Charlie, urging them down the aisle. "Don't let go," he yelled, but the crowd separated them. Mary looked back just in time to see Thomas disappear in the smoke. The canvas overhead collapsed in burning sheets. Screams turned into choking coughs. Horses stampeded, elephants bellowed. Performers ran in every direction. Clowns tore off their makeup-streaked costumes in a frenzy, becoming just as vulnerable as the audience. Outside the tent, people were beginning to emerge, Covered in ash, many burned, some carrying limp bodies. Eleanor staggered out with Billy still clutched in her arms. His popcorn bag was gone, replaced by soot smudges and tears. She collapsed onto the grass, clutching him to her chest. Around her, others were doing the same, looking around in disbelief at the horror that had erupted in mere minutes. Fire engines arrived, but it was too late. The fire had already devoured most of the tent. The structure lay in blackened ruins. The smoke drifted upward in thick clouds, blotting out the sun. The air smelled of scorched fabric, flesh, and sorrow. Hospitals across Hartford quickly filled beyond capacity. Local churches and schools were converted into temporary morgues. At first, no one had an accurate count of the dead. The numbers kept changing. Some said 50, 80, then over 100. In the end, 167 lives were lost. Most of them children. Among the bodies was a little girl, around 6 years old, dressed in a white dress. She was never identified and came to be known simply as Little Miss 1565, named after the number assigned to her in the morgue. Her photo would be published in newspapers across the country, becoming one of the most haunting images of the tragedy. Investigators soon began asking questions. How had the fire started? Was it arson? Negligence? A cigarette? Theories flew, but answers were slow to come. Rumors swirled about a mysterious man seen near the canvas before the fire began. Jimmy, the young usher, gave a statement about what he'd seen. A faint flicker, then a strange chemical smell like lighter fluid. But no one could find any definitive proof. The press called it one of the worst fire disasters in American history. The Ringling brothers were held accountable for poor fire precautions. Their use of the paraffin-gasoline mixture came under scrutiny. Survivors and victims' families filed lawsuits. The company paid out millions in damages, but no money could bring back the lost. Eleanor returned home with Billy, but neither of them would ever be the same. Billy stopped speaking for weeks. At night, he'd wake screaming, crying for his father who was far away in Europe. Eleanor tried everything: music, books, therapy, but the shadow of the fire lingered. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames again, saw the tent collapsing, heard the screams. Mary Franklin never saw her husband again. His body wasn't found until 2 days later, trampled and burned. She buried him beside their daughter's grave. Rose hadn't made it out either. Charlie survived but bore burn scars up both arms. Henry had a broken leg and trauma that would last a lifetime. Jimmy Holt was hailed as a hero for pulling out children and guiding people to safety, but he didn't feel like one. He had nightmares for years, each more vivid than the last. He left Hartford shortly after the fire and never returned. Some say he moved out west and changed his name, trying to leave the past behind. But the fire followed him everywhere. The town of Hartford never truly recovered. A memorial was built in the North End to honor the victims. A quiet field now sits where the big top once stood, and each year on July 6th, people gather there, lighting candles, whispering prayers. Some come alone, some come with family, but they all remember. The night the circus caught fire was more than a tragedy. It was a wound carved into the heart of a nation, a brutal reminder that joy and terror often walk hand in hand. The sound of laughter can turn into screams in an instant. And sometimes, the most magical places can become the most haunted. Weeks passed, and Hartford carried the weight of grief like a heavy coat it couldn't shrug off. Funerals seemed never-ending. The once vibrant circus posters still hung tattered on telephone poles and fences, now grim reminders of that awful day. Parents who had once counted down the days to the circus now stared blankly at dinner tables with empty chairs. Schools left desks untouched where students never returned. The sound of a child's laugh had become something sacred, scarce, fragile. The investigation continued. City officials and Ringling Brothers management were under enormous pressure from the public. The cause of the fire remained uncertain, though whispers of arson began to take hold. A man named Robert Seggy, a former circus employee, eventually came forward years later claiming he'd set the fire. He described visions of a woman in flames, telling him to burn things. But even that confession didn't bring closure. It came too late, too vague, too far removed from evidence to hold weight. For those who survived, life splintered into two timelines, before the fire and after. Billy Davis, once a bright and energetic boy, became quiet and withdrawn. The joy that used to radiate from him was muted, hidden behind distant eyes. Eleanor enrolled him in counseling, something that was rare and almost taboo in 1944, especially for a child. But she knew something inside him had cracked. He wouldn't talk about the circus. He wouldn't say the word elephant. And he couldn't sleep without a light on. One evening in early September, Eleanor stood in his doorway watching him sleep. The soft light of a lamp cast a warm glow across his blanket, and for a moment, it looked like nothing was wrong. But she knew better. That night, she wrote a letter to Frank, trying not to let the paper absorb her tears. "Billy is different now," she wrote. "He sees things I wish he didn't have to." Elsewhere in town, Mary Franklin visited the cemetery every morning. She brought fresh lilies for Thomas and Rose, arranging them neatly beside their headstones. Charlie, now 10, walked beside her. His arms were healing, though the skin was mottled and tight. He never complained about the pain. Not once. But he often asked questions Mary couldn't answer. Why did it have to happen? Was it the circus's fault? Will it happen again? One day he asked the hardest one of all. Why did Grandpa try to save us when he knew he couldn't make it out? Mary took his hand and squeezed it tightly. "Because love makes us do brave things, sweetheart," she said softly. "Even when we're scared." Jimmy Holt, the teenage usher, was never seen in Hartford again. He'd left quietly, slipping out of the hospital where he'd been treated for smoke inhalation, and headed west. He ended up in St. Louis, working odd jobs under the name James Allen. He kept to himself, lived frugally, and stayed away from large crowds. He never married. People who met him described him as kind, quiet, and deeply watchful, like someone who had seen something they couldn't forget. Years later, a young reporter named Lisa Warren tracked him down after reading an obscure survivor's testimonial that mentioned a teenage boy who saved her life during the fire. She found Jimmy, now James, working as a night janitor at a public library. When she approached him and asked if he was the boy from the Hartford fire, he didn't deny it. But he didn't confirm it either. He just looked out the window and said, "I still hear the screams sometimes. That doesn't go away." Lisa published her article in a local St. Louis paper, and though it didn't make national headlines, it circulated among fire survivors and their families. Jimmy never responded to the mail that followed. Thank you letters, invitations to memorials, even a few checks he returned unopened. He didn't want recognition. He only wanted peace. In 1945, the state of Connecticut passed new fire safety regulations. Circuses were banned from using flammable materials for tents. Fire exits had to be clearly marked and unobstructed. Fire drills became standard, even for temporary venues. These changes came too late for Hartford, but they were born from its ashes. Little Miss 1565 remained unidentified. Despite thousands of inquiries, letters, and even proposed adoptions from families who had lost children, no one could match her to a name. Her photo, haunting, beautiful, still, was etched into the memory of the nation. She was buried with a small white marker bearing her nickname. In 1991, a man named Rick Davey claimed to have discovered her true identity as Eleanor Emily Cook, a young girl whose body had been misidentified in the confusion. But even this claim remains debated. The mystery persists. By 1954, the circus was changing. Attendance was down, the world was shifting, and people were looking for different kinds of entertainment. Television was the new magic. The traveling circus was becoming a relic of a different era. The Ringling Brothers eventually stopped using big tops altogether and moved their shows into permanent arenas. Still, each year in Hartford on July 6th, a quiet ceremony is held. No fanfare, no advertisements. Just candles, names read aloud, and silence. Some bring newspaper clippings. Others bring old ticket stubs, pressed between plastic sheets. Survivors hold hands. Grandchildren come along, trying to understand a horror they've only heard about in whispers. Billy Davis grew into a thoughtful young man, then a father, and eventually a grandfather. He became a teacher, one who was gentle with shy students and patient with those who struggled. In private he painted. Not landscapes, not people, just fire. He painted flame after flame, always contained in the frame, never wild. When asked about it, he would only say, "It helps me remember, but also control it." One of his students, a curious young girl named Nina, once asked him what scared him most in the world. He paused before answering. "Not the fire," he said. "The silence that came after. That's what stuck with me." Mary Franklin passed away in 1959. Charlie, her grandson, became a firefighter. He said it was his way of making sense of things. He said he wanted to be the kind of man who ran into burning buildings, because he knew what it felt like to wait for someone who never came out. In the end, the fire at the Hartford Circus wasn't just a disaster. It was a fracture in the story of America, a moment that ripped joy away from children and demanded that safety become a priority instead of an afterthought. It was a reminder that wonder must be paired with responsibility, and that no amount of magic is worth a single innocent life. Today, when people speak of the fire, they speak softly, as if the flames could still be listening. They speak of Eleanor Davis, who shielded her son with her own body. Of Thomas Franklin, who carried 2 grandchildren to safety before turning back and never returning.